Hello, everyone. When we think about how a nation is born, our minds often jump to big, dramatic revolutions, right? But what if I told you a nation could be formed in a completely different way, a much slower, more gradual process? In this explainer, we're going to look at the very unique case of Great Britain's formation, and then we'll get into something really fascinating, the art of nation building. I mean, how do you give a face to something as big and abstract as a country? Let's find out.
So we'll tackle this in two parts. First, we'll dive into the story of Britain, and you'll see why its path was so different from its neighbors in Europe. Then, in part two, we'll explore how artists use symbols and personification to help people feel a real connection to their nation.
All right, let's begin with part one, the strange case of Britain. Now, why do we call it strange? Well, its journey to becoming a nation-state was very, very unusual. It really makes you ask the question, was it even possible to build a nation without a sudden violent revolution?
Just think about it for a moment. When we study the making of nations like France or even Germany, we learn about revolutions, big wars, and all sorts of dramatic events. But was that the only way? Well, the case of Britain shows us that there was in fact another path.
This comparison is really the key. On one hand, you have many European nations that were born from the fire of revolution and war. But on the other hand, the British nation-state was different. Its formation wasn't a single explosive moment, but a long, drawn-out process that took centuries. Understanding this difference is really crucial. So, how exactly was this nation put together? Well, before the 18th century, there was no British nation to speak of. The islands were home to several different ethnic groups. You had the English, the Welsh, the Scot, and the Irish. And each of these groups had its own unique culture and its own political traditions.
Now, this is a very important point to remember. This unification was not a merger of equals, not at all. It was really driven by England. As the English nation became richer and more powerful, it started to extend its influence over the other nations on the islands. So, English dominance was the real engine behind this whole process.
So, let's look at how this happened, step by step. The whole process unfolded over more than a century. It really started around 1688, when the English Parliament took power from the king. This made Parliament the main force for building the nation. Then came a huge step in 1707, the Act of Union. This act joined England and Scotland to create the United Kingdom of Great Britain. And finally, in 1801, Ireland was forcibly incorporated. Notice that word, forcibly. This was not a voluntary partnership. It was a slow but very forceful expansion of English control.
This process eventually created what we call a nation-state. But what does that term actually mean? It's a key concept. A nation-state is not just a piece of land with a government. It's a place where most of the people, the citizens, feel a sense of common identity, a shared history and culture. The goal in Britain was to create this new British identity, but it was an identity that was heavily shaped by English culture and English power.
But you see, this unification came at a very high price. It is so important for us to understand that this was not a partnership of equals. This new British identity was actually built on English dominance and, well, tragically, on the suppression of the other cultures.
Let's just take the example of Scotland. After the Act of Union, its unique culture and political systems were systematically taken apart. The new British Parliament in London was, of course, dominated by English members. In the Scottish Highlands, the Catholic clans who tried to resist faced terrible repression. Their very identity was attacked, they were forbidden from speaking their own Gaelic language or even wearing their national dress. And in the end, many were forcibly driven right out of their home.
And Ireland's story was tragically similar. The country was already divided between Catholics and Protestants, and the English used this division to their advantage. They supported the Protestants to help them establish dominance over the much larger Catholic majority. And anytime the Catholics tried to revolt against British rule, they were met with brutal suppression.
So what was the final result of all this? A new British nation was created, and this was done by promoting new, powerful symbols that everyone was supposed to share. You have the British flag, the Union Jack, the national anthem, God Save Our Noble King, and of course the English language. These symbols became dominant, and the older nations of Scotland and Ireland were essentially made junior partners in this new union.
All right, so that was the political story. Now, let's shift gears and move to the second part of our explainer, visualizing the nation. Here, we're going to move away from politics and focus more on culture and art. We are going to explore how a huge, abstract idea like a nation is given a real, visual form that people can see and connect with.
I mean, just imagine you're an artist back in the 18th or 19th century. You're asked to paint the nation. How would you even begin? A nation is a feeling, an idea of belonging. It's not a person you can just paint a portrait of. So how do you do it?
Well, the solution was a very clever artistic device called an allegory. This is another key term for you. An allegory is when you take an abstract idea, like freedom or justice, or in this case, a nation, and you represent it through a person or an object. It's a smart way to make a big, complex idea visible and easy for people to understand.
So what the artists started to do was personify their nations. They represented the country as if it were a person. And what's really interesting is that they almost always chose female figures. Now, of course, these weren't paintings of any real women. They were symbols, designed to give that abstract idea of the nation a concrete human form.
To make this idea of an allegory perfectly clear, let's look at a very famous example. We'll look at the allegory of Germania and see how she gave a concrete form to the German nation.
And here she is. This is Germania, a very famous painting that represents the German nation. Just look at her for a moment. She wears a crown of oak leaves because in Germany, the oak tree stands for heroism. She looks strong, proud, and protective. This image wasn't just a piece of art. It was a powerful symbol that Germans could look at and feel a sense of unity, a shared identity. She literally gave a face to the idea of Germany.
So, the most important point here is this. These female allegories, like Germania, had a very important job. They took the abstract idea of the nation and made it something tangible, something concrete that people could relate to. And this really helped ordinary people connect with the idea of their country and helped build a powerful shared identity.
Okay, so let's quickly recap the two key takeaways from our lesson today. First, the United Kingdom was not born in a sudden revolution, but through a long, gradual process of English political and cultural domination over Scotland and Ireland. And second, artists played a big role in unifying these new nations by using female allegories, like Germania, to give a powerful, visible face to the abstract idea of the nation.
And that brings us to the end. We've seen how people in the 19th century used symbols to build their nations. So I'll leave you with a final question to think about. If you had to create an allegory for a community that you belong to, maybe your city, your school, or even your country today, what symbols would you choose, and what ideas would they represent? Thank you for joining me.